The first rider appeared at sunrise, then another, then 20 more crested the red ridge behind him. By the time Elias Reed stepped off his porch, nearly 200 Apache riders were descending toward his ranch in a long, silent column. Every settler in Red Wash believed the same thing. The attack had finally come. But Elias saw one face near the front of that column, and understood that the riders were not coming because of what he had taken. They were coming because of what he had given away. 4 days earlier, the New Mexico Territory had looked like a country abandoned by rain. For 113 days, no storm had crossed the Sacramento foothills. The grass had gone gray. Cottonwood leaves curled like old paper. Shallow wells turned bitter, then empty. At noon, lizards disappeared beneath stone. Cattle crowded every shadow, and even the ravens flew with their beaks open. Water was no longer something a man drank without thinking. It was weight, it was distance. It was money, it was life measured by the swallow. Elias Reed knew exactly how little he had. One dented canteen hung from the horn of his saddle. It held less than a quart. That was supposed to carry him 12 miles to the north pasture, where a wind pump had stopped turning sometime during the night. 38 head of cattle waited there. 6 were calves. If Elias could replace the cracked pump rod before the worst heat arrived, the trough might fill again by afternoon. If he could not, he would have to choose which animals were strong enough to drive south and which ones would be left behind. He had already buried 3 that week. At 36, Elias had the sunburned face of an older man and the quiet habits of someone who had lived alone too long. His wife had died of fever 5 winters earlier. Since then, the ranch house had held only his boots, his coffee pot, a stack of unpaid notes from the bank in Las Cruces, and a blue enamel cup she had once used every morning. He kept that cup on a shelf above the stove. His father had given him a rule when he was a boy. A full cup tells you nothing about a man. Watch what he does when the cup is almost empty. Elias had never known whether his father meant water, money, courage, or mercy. That morning, he would discover it meant all 4. He left before dawn, riding a bay gelding named Bishop. The air was cool for the first hour, but by the time he reached the broken lava flats, heat had begun rising from the ground in silver waves. Halfway through a narrow arroyo, Bishop stopped, not slowed, stopped. The horse lifted his head, ears pointed toward a shelf of black rock. Elias followed his gaze. At first he saw only a pale bundle beside a mesquite bush. Then the bundle moved. He dismounted and crossed the sand. A young Apache woman lay on her side beneath the thin shade. One moccasin was missing. A raw cut ran along her ankle and dust coated her face. A small clay water jar lay broken nearby. The dark patch beneath it had already vanished into the earth. Her breathing was so shallow Elias had to kneel to hear it. He looked up the arroyo. No tracks he could read, no voices, no movement except the shimmer of heat. Then he looked at his canteen. 12 miles behind him was home. 6 miles ahead was the wind pump. 38 cattle were waiting. The woman might already be beyond help. He could tell himself that and ride on. No court would condemn him, no neighbor would even know. Elias unscrewed the cap. The smell of warm metal rose from the canteen. He poured a little water onto a corner of his neckerchief and pressed it to the woman's lips. Nothing happened. He waited, then let 3 drops fall into her mouth. Her throat moved. He gave her 3 more. Her eyelids trembled. "Easy," he said. "Not fast." He slipped one arm beneath her shoulders and raised her. She tried to pull away at first, frightened and too weak to understand him. Elias set the canteen in her hands but kept his fingers around it so she could not drink too quickly. She swallowed once. Then again the sound was barely louder than the wind. He watched the waterline fall. Half the canteen, a quarter, 2 mouthfuls, 1. The last swallow disappeared, and Elias felt the strange finality of an empty vessel in his hand. The woman opened her eyes fully. She studied him, then the canteen, then the trail behind him. She understood. She reached toward the small pouch at her waist, but Elias shook his head. No trade. She did not speak English, or chose not to. Instead, she touched 2 fingers to the canteen, then to her heart. Elias removed his hat and wedged it into the mesquite branches to deepen the shade. From his saddlebag, he took a strip of clean cloth and wrapped her ankle. He left her half a piece of hard bread, the only food he had brought. Then he heard stones click high above the arroyo. He turned. Nothing. But in a slit of shadow between 2 boulders, something had moved. Elias had spent enough years outdoors to know the difference between a rabbit and a watcher. He slowly stood. "If she's yours," he called toward the ridge. "She needs more water than I had," silence answered. Elias returned to Bishop. The woman caught his sleeve before he mounted. Her grip was weak but urgent. She pointed at the empty canteen, then toward the south, warning him. "I know," he said. He climbed into the saddle anyway. As he rode out of the arroyo, 3 Apache scouts remained hidden above him. They had been tracking the woman since dawn after her horse had bolted during a rock slide. They had reached the ridge minutes before Elias. They had seen the cattleman count the distance with his eyes. They had seen him hesitate. And they had seen what he chose when his cup was almost empty. Elias reached the north pasture near midday. The cattle were packed against the dry trough, their sides heaving. The windmill tower stood motionless against the white sky. He climbed the ladder with a wrench between his teeth. The metal burned his palms through his gloves. Twice, dizziness forced him to press his chest against the frame. The cracked pump rod had slipped below the guide, and repairing it took longer than expected. By the time he locked the final coupling, his tongue felt swollen. He pulled the brake free. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then a faint breeze moved across the plain. The blades turned once again. Deep beneath the ground, the pump coughed. Mud-colored water spat into the trough, then cleared. The cattle shoved forward. Elias climbed down too quickly, missed the last rung, and hit the ground on one knee. He crawled to the end of the trough, pushed his face beside the cattle, and drank. The water tasted of iron and warm stone. It was the best thing he had ever swallowed. He did not reach home until after dark. The next morning he rode back through the arroyo. The woman was gone, so was his hat. In the sand he found the marks of several horses and one carefully placed object, a small white shell, polished smooth, lying inside the mouth of his empty canteen. He carried both home. For 3 days nothing happened. The drought tightened. A neighbor named Thomas Bell lost 9 cattle when his well rope was cut during the night. 2 miles east, someone smashed the valve on the community cistern. At the stage stop, 3 sealed water barrels vanished from a locked shed without a single hoofprint left on the main road. Fear moved faster than fact. By noon, men in red wash were blaming Apache raiders. By evening, they were polishing rifles. Elias listened from the back wall of the general store while ranchers argued beneath a ceiling fan that did not turn. "They're testing us," one man said. "They know we're dry," another answered. "They'll hit the ranches one at a time." A broad-shouldered cattle buyer named Gideon Voss stood near the counter, saying little. Voss had arrived in the valley the previous winter with 3 wagons, hired hands, and cash enough to buy distressed cattle. Since the drought began, he had purchased more than 200 head for less than half their normal value. He wore a clean black vest even in the heat. He also owned the only deep well still selling water by the barrel. "Fear makes men foolish," Voss finally said, "but being unprepared makes them dead." He offered to organize night patrols. Most of the room agreed. Elias did not. He had seen the tracks in the arroyo. The scouts who recovered the woman could have taken his horse, his rifle, or his life. They had taken none of them. He looked at Voss. How did thieves move 3 barrels from a locked shed without leaving tracks? Voss smiled faintly. "Maybe they know how to hide them, or maybe they used the freight lane behind your stock pens." The room went quiet. Voss's smile disappeared. "You calling me a thief, Reed? I'm asking why everyone decided who did it before anyone followed the ground." Thomas Bell stepped between them before the argument could become something worse. But the damage was done. That night, a stone came through Elias's kitchen window. A scrap of paper was tied around it. "Sell now, water won't save you." Elias read the words twice. Then he looked at the blue enamel cup above the stove. The next morning began with a sound too deep to be thunder. Coffee rippled inside Elias's cup. His dog crawled beneath the table. He stepped outside and saw dust rising beyond the eastern ridge. A boy from the Bell Ranch galloped past the front gate shouting, "Riders! Apache riders!" Doors slammed across the valley. Women pulled children indoors. Men climbed roofs with rifles. At the community well, Gideon Voss shouted orders and sent his hired hands toward the ridge road. Elias stood alone in his yard. The first rider appeared. Then the long column followed, not charging, advancing at a measured walk. Apache men rode at the front, but behind them came women, elders, pack horses, and 2 travois carrying water jars. Their formation was not the shape of a raiding party. It was the shape of a people moving with purpose. Still, nearly 200 mounted figures entering a frightened settlement looked like war to anyone who had already chosen fear. Voss raised his rifle. Elias crossed the road and pushed the barrel down. "Not yet. Get out of my way. Look behind the warriors." Voss did not look. He tried to lift the rifle again. Elias held it down until Thomas Bell and 2 others joined him. The Apache column stopped at the edge of Elias's property. An older leader rode forward with an interpreter, a Mexican trader named Mateo Ruiz who had moved between settlements for years. Beside them rode the woman from the arroyo. She wore Elias's battered hat. For one strange second, under the terror of the whole valley, Elias almost laughed. She dismounted and walked toward him. Her ankle was bandaged. Her face had color again. She held his hat in both hands, brushed clean and reshaped as well as its age allowed. Mateo spoke quietly. "Her name is Sani. She says the hat kept the sun off her face after you left." Elias accepted it. Sani then handed him a new canteen made from thick hide, its seams darkened with careful stitching. The white shell from his old canteen had been tied beneath the cap. Mateo continued. "She says a vessel should not return empty to a man who emptied it for someone else." Behind Elias, rifles slowly lowered. The older leader studied him for a long moment. Then Mateo translated his words. "3 of our scouts watched what you did. They were close enough to save her, but not close enough to reach her before you. You did not know they were there. That is why the act has weight." The leader gestured toward the riders behind him. "We came to return honor. We also came because the same hands stealing your water are stealing ours." A murmur passed through the settlers. Voss stepped forward. "Convenient story." Sani turned toward him. From a pouch she removed a brass valve wheel, blackened at one edge. Mateo explained that it had been found near a ruined spring box used by Apache families. A crescent-shaped tool mark had been cut into its center. Elias knew that mark. He had seen it on the lock plate at the stage stop. The older leader unrolled a piece of canvas on the ground. Small stones marked 7 places across the valley. 2 ranch wells, the community cistern, the stage barrels, an Apache spring, a livestock seep, and a storage pit near the eastern trail. 7 attacks in 12 nights, always after midnight, always near a wagon road, always followed by Voss offering to buy thirsty cattle or sell expensive water. Voss laughed. "Stones on a blanket aren't proof." "No," Elias said, "but the ground might be." The leader pointed toward a narrow passage in the mountains called Cinder Gate. Sani had followed one of the stolen barrel carts before her horse bolted in the rockslide. She had seen wagons enter the canyon before sunrise. Cinder Gate held a permanent spring. On old territorial maps it was marked as common water. Voss had told everyone the spring had collapsed years ago. Elias looked at him. "How much water have you sold us from a spring you said was dead?" Voss's hired men shifted. Voss spread his hands. "You believe them over your own people?" That was the question he wanted everyone to answer. Not whether the evidence was true, whether truth had a tribe. Elias stepped beside Sani. "I believe the cut rope at Bell's Well. I believe the tool mark on that valve. I believe the freight tracks behind your pens. And I believe a man getting rich from a drought deserves more questions than a woman nearly killed by one." Voss's expression hardened. The older Apache leader said something to Mateo. Mateo translated. "We do not ask the settlers to trust every Apache. We ask them to examine the same ground." That sentence changed the room more than any threat could have. Thomas Bell lowered his rifle completely. Then another rancher did the same. Voss walked away. Before sunset, a small alliance formed beneath the cottonwoods beside Elias's ranch. The Apache leader would send 6 trackers. Elias would bring Thomas Bell, Mateo Ruiz, and 2 ranch hands who had no ties to Voss. They would enter Cinder Gate before dawn, confirm the spring, recover whatever had been stolen, and bring evidence back to the territorial marshal. No army, no mob, no revenge, proof first. But someone carried their plan to Gideon Voss before midnight. They left at 2 in the morning. The desert under moonlight looked drowned in blue. The trackers moved without lanterns, reading broken crust, displaced pebbles, and bruised stems Elias could barely see. Sani rode with them. Elias objected when he first learned she intended to come. Her answer through Mateo was simple. "I saw the road in. You saw the marks. We need both." By dawn they reached the western mouth of Cinder Gate. The canyon narrowed between walls of volcanic rock. Cottonwoods grew inside it, their leaves green. After 113 rainless days, the sight felt almost impossible. They crawled to a ledge overlooking the basin. Below them, fresh water poured from a stone channel into a broad natural pool. 4 large freight wagons stood nearby. 23 sealed barrels were stacked beneath canvas. Stolen horses grazed in a rope corral. Crates of dynamite lay beside a cut in the canyon wall, where Voss's men had begun building a crude dam. If they blocked the lower channel, Every ranch and Apache camp downstream would lose access to the seepage that fed their shallow wells. This was not simple theft, it was control. Dry the valley, buy the cattle, sell the water, own whatever remained. Thomas Bell whispered, "We need the marshal." Mateo shook his head. 2 days away. A tracker pointed toward the eastern trail. Dust, riders approaching. Elias counted at least 15. Voss had arrived before they could leave. The group pulled back into a side ravine, but one of the ranch hands panicked. He ran for his horse. A rifle cracked. The horse reared. Men shouted below. Within seconds, the canyon was awake. Elias, Sonny, Mateo, Thomas, and the trackers were trapped above the basin with one narrow path behind them. Voss's riders spread toward both exits. Then Thomas Bell saw the second disaster. Smoke rose from Red Wash. Not campfire smoke. A black column climbed above the southern plain. Voss had sent men to burn the community hay barn while most able riders were away. In a drought, one spark could move through miles of dry grass. They had come looking for stolen water. Now their homes were burning. For the first time, Elias believed he had made the wrong choice. If he had stayed quiet in the general store, Voss might not have marked him. If he had refused the alliance, the ranchers might be fighting the fire. If he had kept his last water, perhaps none of this road would have opened. Guilt can make even a brave decision look foolish after the price arrives. Voss's voice echoed from below. "Reed, send the Apache down unarmed, and I'll let the settlers ride home." Thomas looked at Elias. The offer was a lie, but smoke thickened in the distance. Every minute mattered. The Apache leader's nephew, one of the trackers, signed something to Sonny. She translated through Mateo. "They can hold the ridge. You and the ranchers go." Elias looked at the 6 men who had entered the canyon because he had said proof mattered more than fear. Leaving them would save his ranch. It would also prove Voss right about how easily the valley could be divided. Elias removed the new hide canteen from his saddle. He took one swallow, then passed it to Sonny. "No one goes home by buying the road with somebody else." Sonny looked at him with the same quiet surprise she had shown in the arroyo. The cup was almost empty again, and again Elias chose. But mercy alone would not get them out of Cinder Gate. They needed the ground. One tracker led Elias through a crack behind the ledge. It opened above the stone channel feeding Voss's barrel yard. The outlaws had diverted most of the spring through a timber sluice into their storage pool. Elias studied the braces. Remove one cross pin and the sluice gate would drop. The sudden water would flood the wagon lane, not enough to kill anyone, but enough to turn the powder-dry basin into deep mud. Thomas understood first. His wagons won't move, and his horses will, Elias said. Sonny pointed to the corral. The plan came together without a long speech. The trackers would circle behind the horse line. Thomas and Mateo would reach the dynamite crates and soak the fuses. Elias and Sonny would drop the sluice. Then they would use Voss's own signal bell to call the Apache riders waiting beyond the eastern ridge. They had not brought only 6 trackers. The larger group had remained 2 miles away, prepared to move only if summoned. The column at Elias's ranch had not been an army of revenge. Now it would become a wall Voss could not buy. They moved. A tracker slid down the far slope and cut the corral rope. Thomas crawled beneath a wagon and reached the dynamite crates. Mateo rolled 2 barrels into the powder ditch and split them with an axe. Water poured over the fuses. Voss's men spotted him. A rifle fired. The shot struck the wagon rim. Elias and Sonny reached the sluice brace. The crosspin had swollen in the heat. Elias pulled. Nothing. He struck it with a stone again. Below, Voss shouted for men to climb the ledge. Sonny braced both feet against the timber and pulled beside him. The pin moved half an inch, then stopped. Boots scraped on the path behind them. Elias wrapped a saddle strap around the pin. Sonny looped the other end across her shoulders. "Together," he said. They pulled. The wood screamed. The pin tore free. The sluice gate slammed down. A wall of spring water burst across the wagon lane. Men jumped aside as the dry dust became brown current, then sucking mud. Wagon wheels sank to their hubs. Barrels rolled loose. One split against a rock, spilling water that had been stolen from the entire valley. At the corral, the trackers opened the rope line. 31 horses surged through the basin. Sonny reached Voss's brass warning bell and struck it 3 times. The sound leaped between the canyon walls. Once, twice, 3 times. Then came an answer from beyond the eastern ridge. Hoofbeats, not dozens, hundreds. Voss looked toward the canyon mouth as Apache riders filled it from wall to wall, advancing slowly, weapons visible but lowered. At the western entrance, settlers from Red Wash appeared behind the territorial marshal. who had been intercepted on the road by riders carrying Elias's earlier written warning. Families had contained the hay fire before it reached the houses. The black smoke still rose, but the valley had not burned. Voss was trapped between the people he had tried to make enemies. He raised his pistol toward Elias. Sonny saw it first. She shoved Elias behind the sluice post. The Apache leader's nephew drew but did not fire. Thomas Bell leveled his rifle from the wagon. The marshal shouted, "Drop it!" For one suspended second, every old fear in the territory stood armed in the same canyon. One shot could have turned proof into blood. One frightened hand could have confirmed every lie Voss had sold. Elias stepped from behind the post. "Don't give him the war he needs." The words were meant for everyone. Apache, settler, marshal, outlaw, even himself. Voss looked around and realized the valley was no longer divided enough to save him. His pistol fell into the mud. One by one, his men surrendered. The search of Cinder Gate lasted until afternoon. They found the 23 barrels, 31 stolen horses, 3 sets of branding irons used to alter cattle marks, a ledger listing every desperate ranch Voss expected to buy before winter. Beside each name he had written the predicted week its well would fail. Elias's name was last. Under it, Voss had written "Stubborn, break by fire." They also found a territorial survey showing that the Cinder Gate spring fed underground channels toward both Red Wash and the Apache camps to the east. Blocking it would have damaged 7 shallow wells within a month. The proof did not belong to one side. Neither did the water. By sunset, the crude dam was dismantled. The lower channel ran freely again. Apache families filled clay jars beside ranchers rolling barrels onto wagons. Settler children carried cups to elderly riders. Thomas Bell repaired a broken harness with an Apache horseman who had once watched him from across a rifle sight. No speeches made that possible. Work did. 1 rope, 1 wheel, 1 full vessel passed from hand to hand. The return to Red Wash took 2 days because they stopped at every dry place along the way. At Bell's ranch they delivered 3 barrels. At the stage stop 2. At the Apache camp near the eastern ridge they opened the first wagon and filled every jar before moving on. At Elias's north pasture they poured enough into the trough to hold the cattle until the wind returned. No family received all it wanted. Every family received enough to survive. That was the first rule of the new water council formed the following week. 3 settlers, 3 Apache representatives, and Mateo Ruiz as interpreter and record keeper met beneath the cottonwoods twice each month. They marked springs, repaired channels, organized shared patrols, and agreed that no water source could be claimed in secret while the drought lasted. The arrangement did not erase history. It did not make every rancher trust every Apache family, or every Apache family forget what had been taken from them. Trust that arrives too easily is usually another kind of story. This trust came slowly, with witnesses, with labor, with arguments settled over maps instead of rifles. Elias testified against Voss in the territorial court. Thomas Bell brought the ledger. Sonny brought the burned valve wheel. The marshal brought the branding irons and the survey. Voss was convicted of theft, arson, sabotage, and unlawful seizure of public water. His deep well and freight wagons were sold. The money paid for repairs to 6 damaged water sites and replaced livestock lost during the thefts. But the most important repair could not be purchased. It happened in ordinary moments afterward. An Apache boy showed Elias how to find damp sand beneath a stand of willow. Elias helped rebuild a stone spring box without fencing it from the eastern trail. Sonny learned enough English to tease him about the shape of his old hat. He learned enough of her language to say water, friend, and stubborn, though she laughed at his pronunciation of all 3. By late August, the drought had lasted 147 days. The north pasture windmill failed twice more. 7 calves survived that Elias had expected to lose. Bell's replacement well reached water at 62 feet. And across the valley, more than 70 families, settler and Apache, drew from sources kept open by the council. Those numbers mattered because kindness without structure can disappear as quickly as rain on hot ground. The first canteen saved 1 life. The Alliance saved many. One afternoon, clouds gathered above the mountains. At first, nobody trusted them. Storms had formed before and dissolved without giving a drop. Children came out anyway. Ranchers stood in doorways. Apache riders stopped along the ridge. The air changed. A single raindrop struck the rail of Elias's porch and burst into dust. Then another darkened the step. Within minutes, rain hammered the roof, ran from the eaves, and turned the ranch yard black. Elias placed the blue enamel cup on the porch rail. It filled slowly. Sonny stood beneath the cottonwoods with her family, laughing as children ran through the mud. Thomas Bell removed his hat. Mateo lifted his face to the storm. Elias watched the cup overflow. He thought of the arroyo, the empty canteen, the riders on the ridge, the muddy basin at Cinder Gate, the ledger that had tried to put a price on desperation, and the people now standing in the same rain, no longer because they had forgotten their differences, but because they had refused to let a thief turn those differences into a weapon. His father's rule finally made sense. A full cup tells you nothing about a man. The truth appears when the cup is almost empty. Elias Reed had given away 1 cup of water. What came back was a river no drought could dry.